All right, so I finally got the motor out of my living room. I've been working on this motor for several weeks out in the living room. I live by the water, and I was a little bit worried about all of the machine work that had been done, all that bare, exposed, beautiful metal, getting some oxidation on it. So anyway, I was doing that in the living room. Also have a tight garage. Another thing, you don't get a lot of space when you live down by the water. So cleared out enough space in the garage to get the motor out. I figured before I put the cam towers, the camshafts, and the rest of the motor on, I get out of the house, right? So it's going to get just wider and wider and heavier. So as soon as I mounted the pistons and cylinders, it was time to change locations. So anyway, so from here on, I'll film the rest of the build from my garage. So before I started to mount the heads and camshaft towers, I spent some time cleaning up the chain housings. So there are some shafts that are pressed into the housings at the factory. There's a sealant that's applied on the outside of the housings to keep oil from kind of leaking through those areas. And all of that material was removed by Ollie's when they cleaned up and did the machining on all of my engine parts. So anyway, I ended up using JB Weld, just applied JB Weld over those the areas where those shafts are pressed in. Let that dry overnight. Also, the shafts where the idler arm rests on, mine showed a little bit of wear. So I ended up using some very fine grit sandpaper, 2000 grit, I think, just to kind of clean up those shafts a little bit. I want to make a couple other notes, before we get into installing the heads and camshaft towers. So in my prior video, I showed that I had installed the pistons and cylinders, and wanted to share a couple comments there. So my case, had a lot of machine work done by Ollie's, including, the decks of the spigot areas. Those were all machined so that everything was, nice, flat, even across those surfaces. And so some material was removed. So Ollie's provided 1mm copper gaskets that basically go at the base of the cylinders to really bring back the measurements to stock. I believe stock, from the factory, unmachined case. I believe those copper gaskets are 0.25 millimeters. So anyway, so I had the 1mm gaskets provided by Ollie's. So those were installed underneath my cylinders, in the prior video. So with the gaskets installed, and the cylinders being held down nice and tight by those Stomsky nuts, I was able to bring the cylinders up to top dead center and basically perform the deck height measurement. And so to do that, I used my caliper to measure the height from the piston perimeter edge to the sealing surface of the cylinder. And basically what you're looking for there, but at least the recommendation, is a 1.25 millimeter to 1.5 millimeter, which is 0.05 inches to 0.06 inches. That's, I think, kind of a safety zone that most recommend. You can go for a little bit tighter clearance. The tightest I believe is recommended is 0.045 inches. So anyway, my measurement came in a little bit at the higher end of that range, about not higher, I guess, but 1.3 millimeters is where I measured out. So I was pretty happy with that. If you don't come to the deck height measurement you're looking for, then it's really a process of using different thicknesses of those copper gaskets that are mounted at the base of the cylinders. So moving on from the deck height to the piston to head clearance, you'll notice the photo that I've been showing here. You can see some solder lightly glued on top of the piston, and basically what I've done is taken solder and used a little bit of Curel T to kind of hold that solder to the top of the piston dome. And so in addition to the deck height, I wanted to measure the piston to head clearance, given that I've got high dome pistons here. So anyway, you can see how it's applied. I'm also showing a photo here where that's being done across all 3 cylinders, because again, I'm going to be mounting the heads and the camshaft towers as one unit, one complete bank. So when I torque that bank down and turn the motor over, I just wanted to make sure that there was proper clearance across all of the cylinders. Okay, so here's the setup. Got the motor out here, relocated in the garage. I'm going to be installing the cam towers and heads today. If you recall, I actually mounted up the towers and heads all together as one assembly. So I'm going to get my son to help lift that assembly on. It's fairly heavy. I've got the oil return tubes all ready to go. Use a little bit of motor oil to lube up those large O-rings to slip them over nice. So those will be ready to go when we bring over the heads and cam towers. And here's the first side. So we bring it over the right side of the motor first. Again, here you go. It's all one assembly. I've actually got my camshafts in there, even mounted up the rockers on both sides. I started to do the rockers on the number 1 and 4 cylinders. I'll be doing using those for the valve to piston clearance check, using the drop method. So anyway, so here we go. I'm going to grab my son and keep this project moving. All right, so here's the first sort of test fit of one of these head banks. So my son and I carefully lifted one bank of heads over. I use a rubber mallet to help kind of seat it. And then you'll see that I also just went ahead and torqued down the bank. There's really no need to have the chain housing. You see me bringing the chain housing over here. Does not need to be installed at this point. So again, I'm mounting this bank of heads. I'll be torquing them down. And what I'm doing, initially I want to, again, validate that I've got proper piston to head clearance, right? Again, going back to the solder that I have attached to the piston heads. And I'm also going to test the valve to piston clearance by using the drop method. Okay, so it's time to torque down this first bank. You can see I'm actually using a magnetic tool to help me sort of slip the washers down over the studs, the head studs, and then also using that same magnetic tool to kind of drop down the barrel nuts. I just found that it was a little bit easier dropping those things down and getting them properly, seated or over those studs. So once those are all on, you want to use a 10 millimeter Allen attachment to tighten down or torque down those barrel nuts. The final torque value that you're going for here is 23.5 foot-pounds of torque. What you want to do an initial, you basically want to make sure you're using the right sequence, first of all, for torquing those down. You can see in the video the sequence that I'm using. Certainly go on the internet and you can see photos of that sequence as well. But you want to do, a partial torque across the full sequence, and then come back a second time and go for the rest, right? Go for the full torque value of 23.5 foot-pounds. So I didn't capture it in the video, but as I mentioned earlier, I needed to check the piston to head clearance. So after I had torqued all this down, I went ahead and turned the motor over to verify the solder was not being crushed too far, giving me too tight of a clearance, too tight of tolerance. So I ended up, removing this bank, checking the thickness of the solder to make sure I had, that range of of 1 to 1.5 millimeters of clearance all across that dome, that piston dome. You know, and I did. So I had the clearance I was looking for. So I took the solder off and actually went back, remounted the bank of heads and retorqued them down. All right, so moving on to the other side of the motor. Time to kind of swing the motor around on the engine stand to bring up the other pistons and cylinders, the other side. So there are some things on this side that I did a better job of capturing in my video that I didn't on the other side. So I want to make sure there's a few things I point out here. First of all, you can see that I am cleaning everything up with Kimtech wipes and alcohol. I've already done my piston to head clearance measurement. So, you know, the domes of the pistons are all cleaned up, you know, with the Curel T's been removed, the solder's been removed. I'm also cleaning up the surfaces of the pistons to make sure everything's nice and clean there for the sealing surface to the heads. Not the pistons, I'm sorry, the cylinders. Also cleaning the ends of the head studs, because what you're gonna see here, again, I missed this in the prior video, but you do wanna apply anti-seize to each of the head studs, the threads at the end of those head studs. That's important for getting the proper torque value on the nuts. And also that I missed on the prior view is you got to make sure that you install the oil return tubes, right? So make sure that those are nice and seated. Again, I use a little bit of motor oil to lubricate those large O-ring seals. So once you've got the oil return tubes installed, you've cleaned everything up nice, you've applied your anti-seize. I use an acid brush to go ahead and apply that anti-seize here to the threads. Then you're going to go ahead and lift that second bank of heads in the camshaft tower and repeat the process that I had shown on the first side. All right, so I didn't have my son's help on this side of the motor, so I did go ahead and lift this second bank of heads, brought it over, carefully found the holes for those head studs. I used a rubber mallet to help seat it. This is definitely one of the disadvantages of the approach I took, using an entire bank instead of one head at a time and then mount the camshaft tower, is that it's heavy. It's bulky and it's heavy. So this was, heavy. It's better to have a helper like I did on the other side. But anyway, so I found the proper seating for this bank. Once I found the proper seating, I went through the same process as I had shown on the other side, right? So I installed the washers and the barrel nuts on each of those head studs and then went through the torquing process. Again, I found it easier to use a magnetic tool to get the washers down over those head studs, and also do the initial seating of the barrel nut on top of the head stud. And then you need to use a 10mm Allen tool to tighten those down, the final torque value being 23.5 foot-pounds of torque, and make sure that you're using that proper sequence of torquing. You can look and see the sequence in the video here, but it may be easier if you Googled on the internet, some photos of that sequence. Okay, exciting milestone here for the motor build. Just doing the final torque here on this bank. So both sides of the motor now are all set. I've got all the head studs torqued down to their final value, and I'm going to go ahead and move forward with checking the piston to valve clearance. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier in the video, to check the piston to valve clearance, I use what's called the drop method. And so first thing I needed to do was make sure I could find top dead center of piston number 1. So I bought a piston stop tool, which basically you use to screw into the spark plug hole for cylinder number 1. And really what it does, it's almost like a plunger. It basically will touch the top of the piston, and it will move up and down as that piston moves up and down. So you want to carefully turn the motor over, and basically you want to find the point where that piston has reached its maximum height. And so again, as you can see in the video here, as I'm turning the motor over, you can see the piston stop tool move up and down as it's tracking with the movement of the piston. So again, find the maximum height and then stop there. Okay, so for this next step in the process of using the drop method for measuring piston to valve clearance, unfortunately I didn't capture on video, but I'm going to go ahead and describe what you need to do. So once you have verified that you have the engine at top dead center for cylinder number 1, which is the process I just showed using a piston drop tool, you want to back out the retaining nut all the way on the valve adjustment screw for cylinder number 1. And then you want to rotate the screw in, so tightening, until it touches the tip of the valve. So basically what you've done now is you've completely removed the valve clearance. There is no clearance now between the screw and the tip of the valve. You want to make sure you're careful though. You don't want to install or tighten the retaining nut on the screw. Now that you've zeroed out the valve adjustment clearance, we're going to measure how far we can extend the valve down into the combustion chamber until we can feel it make contact with the surface of the piston. So essentially, the thread pitch of the adjustment screw is exactly 1 millimeter. So that means for every full turn of the adjustment screw, so a 360-degree rotation, the screw will open the valve exactly 1 millimeter. So by turning the screw and counting the number of turns until the valve rests up against the piston, you can determine the clearance between the two at any one position of the camshaft. So again, one turn of the screw equals 1 millimeter, which is 0.04 inches. So based on my research, the piston to valve clearance should be kept within a minimum range of 1.5 millimeters for the intake valves and 2 millimeters for the exhaust. Otherwise, you can risk piston to valve collision, which certainly is not a good thing. Okay, so in my next video, I'll be showing you how I timed the camshafts.